Whitcomb lay between a black sea and a blacker marsh in the winter of 1893. The kind of place where the church bells sounded like a throat clearing before a confession, and the wind read names off the gravestones. In a salt-bitten house on Fisher Lane, the lantern burned low in the nursery while 3 adults hovered in the doorway, refusing to step inside as if the threshold itself held a charge. The child, 2-year-old Margaret Whitcomb, slept on her side in a white smock, her breath rising in barely visible threads, the brass bars of the crib glinting like a small cage for something holy. Eliza Whitcomb, pale and watchful, touched the key that hung on a ribbon around her neck, then passed it to her husband so the nurse could see, so the vicar could see, so everyone would agree the lock was real and the sleep was real and nothing could pass those bars without hands and intention. Outside, the tide clawed at the pilings and the gulls screamed as if driven by a memory older than the village, but inside the room a hush settled, the kind that follows a verdict. There was nothing dramatic, no slammed door, no shattering of glass, only the lantern's wick guttering and the tiny click of settling wood. And then Eliza, convinced by a mother's terror that looking would break the spell, folded the blanket tighter and stepped backward, closing the door until it latched. The 3 of them climbed the stairs to the kitchen to brew a broth nobody would drink, and the minutes slipped like fish through wet hands, ordinary and slippery and easy to underestimate. When the vicar asked what harm it could do to look again, they returned, a little ashamed of their fear, a little bound to it, and Eliza lifted the ribbon from her husband's palm as if lifting a sentence from his mouth. The key entered the lock with a resistant scrape, and the lock answered with a thick animal turn. The air smelled of iron and milk. The lantern was where they had left it, the blanket folded just so, and the crib stood waiting, locked, whole, merciless. They looked down, expecting Margaret's slow breath, the looseness of limbs that speaks of safety, and saw only the imprint of a small body in the ticking, a perfect hollow with a ruffled edge, as if sleep itself had been lifted out and carried away. Eliza did not scream. She clasped the bars and pressed her face to the cold brass until her skin flattened pale, and her husband tried the lock again and again, turning it and turning it as if he could grind time backward. The nurse dug her nails into her apron and whispered that no one had touched the child, that she had watched the door, that she would swear on marrow and salt. A search began, frantic in its first intention and then increasingly organized under the vicar's measured voice, as if order could reassemble a child. Men with lanterns combed Fisher Lane, boots sinking into sodden earth, speaking to each other in short, breathy fragments that made the night feel crowded. Women carried blankets to the quay and called Margaret's name into the tide as though the sea kept a ledger. They opened cupboards and coal scuttles and bread bins and lifted floorboards where the nails were weak. They checked along the hedges where fishing line caught and tore like spider silk. They cut the cord from a bell and dragged it through the marsh like a snare for luck. When the sun rose thin and metallic, there was still no trace, not a hem, not a hair caught on a splinter, not a wet footprint on the nursery plank. The crib remained the one fixed point, a closed circle with a key that turned and a mother who could no longer swallow water without choking. By afternoon, the village had its story ready. the one it keeps behind the others for when the ordinary explanations break apart. Some said the hollow nurse had come, the old marsh figure who watches over children only long enough to measure their warmth, then returns at an hour that pleases her to collect them. Others muttered that the priest had brought a quiet punishment down, confusing sacraments with bargains. A few insisted that the sea sent its own midwives, women of bone and weed, who slip through iron as easily as through foam. Eliza heard every version and seemed to accept none. She stood in the nursery doorway with her fingers pressed to the jamb until tiny crescents of blood marked where the wood bit back. The vicar, keeping notes already like a coroner of moments, drew the room as it had been and as it was now, placing a little cross where the lantern sat, a little circle where the footprints ended, and he found himself scratching into the margins the simple word impossible until the letters looked like fences. No one admitted how quickly fear had turned to inventory. The counting of nails, the measuring of gaps between bars, the weighing of wet blankets as if water could stand in for a child. The father, Arthur, searched the crib mattress, pressing it, lifting it, smelling it, then taking the entire thing into his arms and shaking it by the window, as if Margaret might fall out like a lost coin. He turned the key in his palm so often that a shallow groove appeared in the skin, a new line where a lifeline might have been. Night fell again, and with it came a softer noise than the sea, a careful shuffling like someone arranging instruments on a cloth. People began to remember the stranger with the cases of wax cylinders, the man who had asked if the church bell was tuned by ear or by mathematics, the one who said certain tones could loosen the knot between body and will. No one said his name yet because names make shapes in the air and shapes can be noticed. Inside the locked room, the empty crib waited with the patience of metal, and the house took on the smell of singed oil and old milk and breath held too long. A story this clean does not want to be touched, but it wants to be believed. Whitcomb believed it, and in that belief something old began to move, not with footsteps, but with measures and rules and the slow confidence of a ritual that had been tried many times and never confessed. In the weeks that followed Margaret's disappearance, the Whitcomb home became quieter than the churchyard at midnight. At first, Eliza still moved through the rooms in slow, deliberate circuits, folding laundry that didn't need folding, adjusting curtains that hadn't shifted, wiping the same patch of counter until the wood began to lose its grain. Then, without warning, her voice went out. She did not speak to Arthur, to the nurse, to the vicar. She didn't even murmur in her sleep. It was not the silence of someone refusing to talk. It was as if language itself had been cut from her, leaving her breath intact but her words gone. She would open her mouth now and then as though about to say something important, only for nothing to emerge but the faint sound of her swallowing. The village, which had always known her as a woman of steady, practical warmth, began to talk about the change as if it were a second disappearance. The nursery became her only territory. She kept the door half closed, enough to let in a stripe of light, but not enough for anyone to see her face. Hours at a time she sat beside the locked crib, her hands resting on her knees, eyes fixed on the hollow where Margaret's body had once pressed into the ticking. The nurse once crept close enough to glimpse Eliza's fingers scratching. not at her own skin but at the wooden frame of the crib. The sound was faint and steady like the gnawing of a small animal. When the nurse dared to look later, she saw the marks, thin, deliberate cuts forming shapes that did not resemble letters or numbers but some repeating geometry of intersecting lines and angles. The edges of the marks were too precise for fingernails, yet no knife was ever seen in her possession. Arthur begged the doctor from the next parish to visit. The man examined her eyes, her throat, her hands. He declared that grief could knot a person so tightly they forgot how to untie themselves. But when Arthur pressed him privately, asking if grief alone could make a woman carve the same exact pattern into wood 100 times over, the doctor looked at the floor and muttered that grief took different shapes for different souls, and this was one he did not wish to name. The vicar tried a different approach, reading psalms outside the nursery door, hoping rhythm might coax her voice back. Instead, the scratching sounds grew sharper, the patterns on the crib lengthening into something like a frame that enclosed the hollow where the child had lain. Some nights Arthur would wake to find Eliza gone from the bed. He would find her in the nursery, candle lit, head bent, eyes fixed on the crib, her lips moving silently. He told himself she was praying, but there was no softness to the way her jaw moved, no plea in her gaze. It was the kind of speaking a person does when reciting something, memorized, the kind of thing learned from someone else, not from the heart. He tried once to shake her from it, gripping her shoulders until she blinked up at him. But she only walked back to the bed without a sound, leaving the candle burning. By the third week, the patterns had expanded beyond the crib. They appeared on the floorboards, etched into the wood near the baseboards, curling up toward the walls like frost patterns in reverse. The nurse swore she saw them faintly glowing one night in the half-dark, though she admitted later she might have imagined it. Still, she refused to step into that room again, claiming the air inside made her ears ring. Arthur's patience thinned to desperation. He locked the nursery door and kept the key on his person. Eliza did not resist. She simply moved her silent work to the underside of the dining table, carving into the wood with such persistence that the knife marks began to thin its legs. The villagers saw her less and less. When she did appear, fetching water from the pump or standing in the cold outside the church, she stared straight ahead, unblinking, as though watching something only she could see. Mothers began pulling their children closer when passing her. They whispered that she was waiting for someone. Some said it was Margaret she was waiting for. Others claimed it was something older, something she had called without meaning to and now could not send away. The first time Arthur found her in the attic, she was sitting cross-legged before the trunk that had belonged to her grandmother. Inside lay old linens, family Bibles, and a single folded sheet of paper so brittle it cracked at the edges. On it were diagrams that matched the carving she had made in the crib. Eliza held the page to her chest as if it were a child. When Arthur reached for it, she turned her face away, lips moving again in that silent recital. He told himself it was nonsense, but he could not shake the feeling that she was not simply remembering their daughter. She was rehearsing, preparing. The man arrived on a windless afternoon when the sea looked like hammered tin and the gulls circled low without calling. His name was Doctor. Lionel Harrow, though he offered it as if it were of little consequence, the way a man might introduce the maker of his coat. He was tall, narrow in the shoulders, with a face that seemed to be always considering the next thing you were about to say. His luggage was peculiar, a leather case reinforced with brass corners, another smaller case wrapped in oilcloth, and a stack of wooden boxes with slatted sides, each padded with cloth and marked with stenciled numbers. He gave the impression of someone used to traveling alone, and yet his eyes moved as though checking an unseen companion's approval before speaking. He introduced himself to the Whitcombs as a researcher of acoustic anthropology, a phrase so strange it softened Arthur's suspicion. Harrow claimed to be collecting the sounds of grief for a study comparing mourning rituals across Europe. He said the human voice in its deepest sorrow revealed truths that language could not carry. He asked to hear about Margaret, but not in words. He wanted Eliza's breath, her sigh, her sobs, recorded on his wax cylinders. Arthur declined on her behalf, explaining she no longer spoke at all. But Harrow's expression did not falter. Instead, he asked to see the nursery. Inside, his gaze moved over the crib, the scratched patterns, the lingering smell of candle wax and milk. He stepped closer than seemed polite, pressing his fingertips to the carved grooves, tracing them as if reading Braille. His eyes closed briefly, his lips parting just enough for a breath that was not quite surprise, not quite satisfaction. He asked too casually whether the room had ever been measured for resonance. When Arthur asked what he meant, Harrow explained that certain shapes, certain materials held and bent sound differently, and that in some rare cases sound could linger long after the source had gone. That night in the inn where Harrow took his room, the innkeeper's boy said he heard strange noises, thin, high cries mixed with a low, mechanical hum, coming from behind the closed door. In the morning, Harrow emerged, smiling faintly, his hands dusted with a pale, waxy residue. He carried the smaller oilcloth case everywhere he went, and when villagers asked what was inside, he would simply say, "Memory," as if that were an adequate answer. He began to spend hours in the marshes, placing small horn-shaped devices into the mud, winding their handles and standing perfectly still as though waiting for a reply from the earth itself. Sometimes he brought these devices to the edge of the Whitcomb property, setting one just beneath the nursery window, turning the crank until the wax cylinder inside turned with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Arthur told him to stop, but Harrow's politeness was so exact, so disarming, that he always managed to leave before the demand became action. One evening, the vicar visited Harrow under the pretext of welcoming him properly. Over tea, the vicar noticed a ledger on the desk, its pages divided into neat columns. Each entry had a name, a date, and a note in fine slanting script. Some names belonged to children from the village, though they had died decades earlier. Others were from places no one in Whitcomb had heard of. Near the bottom of the last page was Margaret Whitcomb. The space for her date was blank. When the vicar asked, Harrow said dates must be earned, not assumed, and closed the ledger with care. The villagers began to keep their children indoors, though they could never agree why. Some spoke of Harrow's questions, how he asked about the pitch of a baby's cry, whether it rose or fell at the end, how long it took for silence to follow. Others spoke of finding tiny discs of hardened wax on their windowsills in the morning, as if something had been pressed there in the night and removed before dawn. The nurse at the Whitcomb house claimed to have seen Harrow standing outside the nursery after midnight, holding a horn to his ear, listening not to the sea or the wind, but to the very air between the house and the dark. It was not until years later that Harrow's attic would be opened, revealing dozens of those cylinders, each labeled with names and dates, their surfaces etched with grooves too fine for the naked eye to follow. Many had been replayed so often that the wax had worn thin, as if the sound inside had been mined for something it contained. Margaret's cylinder, unlike the others, was not dated, and when it was placed on the phonograph, the sound that emerged was not crying or speaking. It was a low, layered chord, like several breaths taken at once, stretched out and bound together, rising and falling with a rhythm too precise to be accidental. It was the sound of something being held. 3 weeks after Margaret vanished, the marsh gave something back, though not what the village had prayed for. It was a boy, perhaps 8 or 9. His body caught among the black reeds where the water narrowed into a sluggish channel. The men who pulled him out did so in silence, their boots sinking into the mud with slow sucking sounds, their faces fixed not on the boy, but on the way the skin along his cheeks seemed too smooth, too pale, as if it had been handled for hours by careful, unhurried hands. His mouth was sealed shut, not sewn, but plugged with a disc of beeswax pressed flush against his lips. The smell of it, faint and sweet, carried even in the cold air. When they turned him over, they found hundreds of tiny punctures patterned across his chest, not random but arranged in perfect grids like the holes of a delicate instrument. The doctor called from the next parish could not guess at the cause of death. The boy had been in the water long enough for his skin to take on that waxen hue, yet the preservation of his features, the perfect symmetry of the marks, unsettled him more than the drowning itself. When he removed the beeswax plug, there was no rush of water from the lungs, only a faint sour odor, as if something organic had been sealed away and then taken out again. He suggested the punctures could have been made with fine needles, but who would have done so and why he could not say. News of the boy's recovery moved through Whitcomb like cold through bone. Mothers began bolting shutters from the inside and keeping the hearth lit through the night. Fathers checked the locks twice before bed, yet somehow each morning new stories surfaced, small, unsettling discoveries made in the gray before dawn. On one doorstep lay a parcel wrapped in white cloth tied with red ribbon containing a child's milk tooth and a sliver of dried seaweed. On another, a small braid of hair knotted with a single stitch of black thread. The parcels bore no notes, no explanation, and vanished if left untouched for more than a few hours, as if reclaimed by the same hands that had delivered them. Arthur Whitcomb avoided the marsh, but one evening he saw Harrow standing there, still as a post, watching the tide creep in. The doctor's black coat flapped lightly in the wind, though his body did not move. At his feet sat the oilcloth case, open to reveal one of his horned recording devices. Harrow held a small notebook, sketching the wax seal taken from the dead boy's mouth with meticulous precision. When he noticed Arthur watching, he closed the case and walked away without a word, his boots leaving no visible impression in the mud. The vicar tried to rally the men to search the marsh by lantern, but the weather turned against them. Thick fog rolled in each night, curling around the willows and muffling the sound of boots on the path. Even those who braved it admitted they walked in circles, hearing their own breathing come back to them from too far away. The nurse, sleepless and pale, insisted she'd heard a faint hum in the fog, a tone that made her eyes water and her heartbeat stumble. She said it came from nowhere and everywhere, as if the marsh itself were holding something alive beneath its surface. By the end of the week, no one spoke of the boy's name anymore. His family left quietly, shutters nailed shut behind them. The beeswax plug was sent to the county for analysis, but the letter that returned weeks later said only that it was of unusually pure composition, with no trace of pollen, dirt, or air bubbles. The puncture marks went unmentioned. In the evenings, Harrow began to walk through the village at a pace so slow it drew notice, pausing now and then to glance at a window or listen at a wall. Once, a fisherman swore he saw Harrow holding a candle up to the mouth of one of his devices, watching the flame flicker in time with some sound too faint for anyone else to hear. The fisherman did not repeat the story until years later, by which time it was one of many that had blurred into the general sense of dread surrounding Harrow's name. The marsh kept its secrets, but something had changed in Whitcomb. An unspoken understanding that the missing girl and the dead boy were connected not by accident, but by the method in which they had been taken. And somewhere in that method was a hand that knew exactly what it wanted and had the patience to wait for it. It was a Sunday when the nurse first noticed the bedroom door would not open. She had brought a tray of broth and bread to Eliza, who had not left the bed in days, but the brass knob refused to turn. She pressed her ear to the wood and heard nothing. No cough, no shifting of blankets, no whisper of movement. Arthur was called, and together they pushed until the hinges groaned, but the door was bolted from the inside. The single key to that bolt hung on a hook in the kitchen, untouched. When the carpenter arrived, he brought a crowbar in the quiet, apologetic manner of a man breaking into someone's private grief. The bolt resisted until the wood around it splintered. The door swung inward to reveal an empty room. The bedclothes were neatly arranged, the basin clean, the single window nailed shut with 3 rusted nails sunk deep into the frame. No dust had shifted on the sill. The air smelled faintly of tallow and something sour, as if milk had been left to turn in a closed jar. On the coverlet lay the crib's original key, gleaming as though freshly polished, and beside it an object so strange the carpenter backed away. It was a human tooth, small, milk-white, a child's, grown around a length of twine so that the cord seemed to sprout from the enamel. The twine was frayed at both ends as if it had been cut free from something taut. The doctor from the next parish examined it without touching, muttering that teeth did not grow around foreign matter, not in the living, and certainly not after death. The vicar, seeing the discomfort ripple through the room, asked for the object to be wrapped and taken to the church. He would not say why, only that some things should rest in consecrated ground until they could be understood. That night the nurse overheard the vicar speaking to Arthur in the hallway. His voice was low, urgent. He spoke of an old practice, whispered about in certain parishes, a binding rite used centuries ago on the dying to prevent their souls from finding their bodies again. It required a token from the person, hair, bone, or tooth bound with a cord, sealed in a room or container until the body was beyond reach. Such rites were not blessings, he said, but locks, and locks always have keys. Where Eliza had gone, no one could answer. Arthur insisted she could not have left through the window without tearing the nails free, and the nails were untouched. The carpenter swore the bolt could only have been thrown from the inside. For days, search parties combed the surrounding lanes, barns, and marsh edges. The fog returned each night, curling against the ground like something that preferred to travel low. The few who thought they heard footsteps in it refused to go far enough to confirm. Inside the house, the patterns Eliza had carved into the crib and floorboards seemed sharper than before, though Arthur could not be sure whether that was a trick of the light or his memory filling in details. The nurse avoided the nursery altogether, but she claimed she sometimes smelled candle smoke drifting down from upstairs, even with the windows closed. Once, late at night, she swore she heard the slow creak of the crib as though it were rocking under an unseen hand. 2 days after the disappearance, Harrow appeared at the Whitcomb home without invitation. He asked to see the bedroom where Eliza had last been. Arthur refused, but the doctor's eyes kept drifting upward as though listening for something in the beams. Before leaving, Harrow placed a folded scrap of paper on the kitchen table and said, "In case she comes back." When Arthur opened it later, he found not words but a diagram, 3 concentric circles, the innermost crossed with lines that formed the same geometric shapes Eliza had carved into the crib. At the center of the drawing was a single black dot. By the week's end, no one was certain whether to hope for Eliza's return. The villagers' whispers turned from pity to speculation. Some claimed she had gone into the marsh to give herself to whatever had taken Margaret. Others swore she had been pulled through a locked door the way Margaret had been pulled from a locked crib. The carpenter, unable to stop thinking about the tooth and cord, confessed to a friend that he had dreamed of the object in his own mouth. The twine threaded down his throat, pulling him somewhere he could not resist. In the absence of answers, the vicar held a small service in the Whitcomb home, blessing each room with water drawn from the church's oldest font. Harrow did not attend, but he was seen that same evening walking the perimeter of the house, stopping at each corner as though taking a measure only he could read. When he passed the nursery window, he paused, tilting his head as if listening to a sound no one else could hear, his expression somewhere between reverence and hunger. Arthur slept downstairs after that, the bedroom door nailed shut on his own orders. Yet even in the parlor he could not escape the sense that something was pacing above him at night, slow, even steps that paused exactly above his head before moving on again. The creaking floorboards were never out of place in the morning, and the dust in the upstairs hallway showed no footprints at all. Still, each night the steps returned, as regular as the tide, and Arthur found himself gripping the crib's key in his pocket until dawn. The parish church had stood for nearly 4 centuries, its stones worn smooth by salt air and the slow grind of feet shuffling toward the altar. Beneath it the air was different, cold, damp, heavy with the scent of iron nails and mildew. The vicar led Arthur down the narrow steps into the basement, a place used less for devotion than for storage. Racks of candlesticks, tarnished green with age, lined the walls, and stacks of warped hymnals slumped against barrels of lamp oil. In the far corner stood a locked oak cabinet Arthur had never seen opened. The vicar said it contained the parish's oldest records, marriage ledgers, baptism logs, burial lists dating back to the 1600s. And something else. The key turned with a reluctant click, and the door creaked open to reveal shelves not only of books but of small cylindrical objects, each wrapped in cloth and labeled in faded ink. Arthur lifted one and found it to be heavier than expected, the cloth inside stiff with age. The vicar explained they were wax cylinders, recordings made on a phonograph in the early 1700s by a priest named Father Crowthorne. Most were blank, or so he had been told, but a handful were said to contain the voices of the afflicted. Arthur asked why they were kept here, locked away in the dark. The vicar avoided the question, unwrapping one labeled Whitcomb, 1720, and setting it on the small hand-cranked phonograph still stored in the cabinet. The first sound was static, like dry leaves shivering. Then came a wail, high, layered, and wrong. It was not one voice, but many, overlapping perfectly, each pitch matching the others so precisely it felt unnatural. There was no echo, no shift in volume, as though the voices were not moving through space at all, but pressed flat into the wax. The longer Arthur listened, the more he felt a pressure in his ears, a tightening at the base of his skull. His breath quickened, though the sound itself never grew louder. When the wail stopped, there was a faint hum, almost soothing in its steadiness, and then the recording ended abruptly, as if cut mid-breath. Arthur asked if Harrow had heard it. The vicar said no, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. He admitted that Harrow had asked more than once to examine the cabinet, claiming he was tracing the heritage of sound in the village. The vicar had refused, but now, holding the cylinder in his hands, he wondered if the man already knew more than either of them. Arthur lifted the other cloths, scanning the labels. Some bore family names he recognized. Others were marked only with years and small hand-drawn symbols. One had no label at all, only a deep scored line running along its length. The vicar took it from him quickly, saying that not all recordings were meant to be played, and returned it to the farthest shelf. He spoke then, in a tone half confession, half warning, of the belief that certain voices, when captured, carried more than sound. That if played too often, they could loosen the listener's hold on their own will, like a knot slipping in wet rope. Before they left, Arthur glanced back at the cabinet. It seemed to lean toward them slightly, as if aware of their retreat. Upstairs, the air in the nave felt sharper, cleaner. Yet the layered wail still clung to Arthur's mind, replaying without his consent. Outside, the gulls were quiet. Harrow stood at the church gate, not looking at them, but at the tower above, as if gauging its height. When his eyes met Arthur's, there was no greeting, only the faint curve of a smile that suggested he already knew where they had been and what they had heard. Miriam Holt was the only one in Whitcomb who would speak of what Harrow had done to her, though even she seemed unsure whether it had been an experiment or a rehearsal. She was a child then, no more than 6, and remembered being led into a small, bare room in her uncle's house where Harrow had been staying. The shutters were nailed shut, and in the center of the room stood a single wooden chair and a table with a brass candlestick. Harrow lit the candle, its thin flame trembling in the still air, and told her to sit and not move until the wax burned halfway. His voice was low, without warmth or threat, but the way he positioned himself in the doorway made her feel that leaving was not an option. At first, the silence was ordinary, just the faint crackle of the wick and the soft hiss of melted wax. Then came a hum, so low she thought it might be the sound of her own blood in her ears. But it grew, deepening, splitting into layers that seemed to pass through her body rather than around it. The flame wavered, bending as if drawn toward some unseen current, and Miriam felt her chest tighten. Her hands twitched against her will, fingers flexing without command. She tried to speak, to ask if she could leave, but her voice would not rise above the hum. It was as if the sound had found its way inside her throat, filling it like liquid. The candle's light grew dim without fading, an impossible dusk that blurred the edges of the room. Then, with no draft, the flame died. She remembered nothing after that until she woke at dawn in a field at the far edge of the village, her hair shorn close to the scalp, her fingernails gone as if pared away with meticulous care. There were no marks on her skin, no sign she had walked the distance herself. Harrow was gone, and her uncle claimed to know nothing. When she told the vicar years later, she said the hum had stayed with her for weeks, sometimes returning in the dead of night, pulling her from sleep with the sense that she was being moved without touching the ground. She believed Harrow's candle had been a signal, a way to open something invisible that could take her from one place to another. She called it the quiet pull, and though she laughed when she said it, the sound was brittle, as though the words themselves might bring it back. Arthur listened to her account with a sick weight in his stomach, thinking of the empty crib, the sealed mouth of the boy in the marsh, and the patterns Eliza had carved. It was all beginning to feel like a single careful sequence, a method carried out step by step, each piece serving a purpose he could not yet name. And if Harrow had done it once, there was no reason to think he would not do it again. The cottage stood alone at the marsh's edge, a narrow structure of weathered timber and sagging roofline that looked more abandoned than inhabited. Harrow had rented it under a false name, paying months in advance with coins so worn their monarchs' faces were little more than shadows. When the constable finally forced entry, citing a missing persons inquiry, he found the main room stripped of anything resembling a home. No chairs, no bedstead, no cooking hearth. Only the floor, raw planks the color of damp ash. And in the center a phonograph standing on a small square of carpet as though it alone deserved comfort. It was the carpenter, the same man who had broken Eliza's door, who noticed the seams in the floorboards. On his knees he traced them with calloused fingers, feeling the faint give beneath. A crowbar revealed the first compartment, a hollow lined with black felt inside which lay a wax mold of a child's open mouth. The detail was perfect down to the curve of the gums, the tiny ridges where teeth had yet to grow. As they searched, more compartments emerged, dozens, each with its own contents. Some held strips of skin stretched taut over wooden frames, pale and translucent. with patterns pressed into the flesh as if it had been laid against a carved surface while still warm. Others contained small glass jars of preserved eyes, each labeled in Harrow's precise script with a name and date. The eyes varied in color and age. Some were clearly infant, others older, but all stared upward as though awaiting recognition. In one compartment they found something that silenced even the constable, a miniature rib cage no larger than that of a sparrow, yet unmistakably human in shape. The bones had been cleaned and polished until they gleamed faintly in the dim light, bound together with thin wire. A tag tied to it bore no name, only a symbol, a set of concentric circles crossed by straight lines. Arthur recognized it instantly. It was the same design Harrow had left on his kitchen table after Eliza vanished. The air in the cottage grew heavy as they opened each compartment, the smell of old wax, dried salt, and something faintly metallic rising from below. There were no signs of Margaret, no scrap of clothing, no hair, but the presence of so many other children lingered like a weight. It was not the chaos of a madman's collection. Everything was placed with deliberate care, catalogued, preserved. This was a record, an archive of something Harrow believed worth keeping. In a small back room they found the oilcloth case open and empty, its brass fittings gleaming as though recently polished. On the wall above it hung a row of hooks, each holding a length of cord tied into different knots. Some were simple loops, others intricate braids, but all had a segment of bone or tooth threaded into them. Beneath each hook was a date, the earliest more than 20 years past. The vicar, who had come at Arthur's request, refused to touch anything. He stood in the doorway with his hands clasped, eyes fixed on the floorboards as though afraid that looking too long might invite whatever purpose these objects served. He muttered something about relics, about the way devotion and cruelty could share the same shape if one was not careful. By the time the search ended, the constable had sealed the cottage and posted a guard, though everyone knew Harrow would not return while the sun was up. Arthur left with the image of those compartments burned into his mind, each one a small coffin without a body, a place for something less visible than flesh. He could not shake the thought that this was not Harrow's first house, nor would it be his last. The method was too polished, too exact for this to be a beginning. Somewhere else, perhaps many somewheres, other floors would be hiding other archives, waiting for someone to open them and see the shape of what Harrow had been keeping safe from the world, or keeping the world safe from. It was a year to the week after Margaret vanished when the news reached Whitcomb. A girl had been found wandering in the market square of a town 15 miles inland, barefoot in the snow. Her hair hacked unevenly as though cut with a blade too dull for the task. She would not answer questions, but when a constable lifted her chin, her face was a near-perfect match for the missing Whitcomb child, save for a pallor like candle wax and eyes that did not seem to settle on the person speaking. Arthur made the journey himself, half believing, half bracing for disappointment. When he stepped into the station where the girl sat wrapped in a borrowed blanket, the recognition hit him like a physical blow. The shape of her mouth, the slight tilt of her head. It was Margaret. Yet something in the proportions was wrong, as if every feature were where it should be but held in place by an unfamiliar frame beneath. She did not call out to him. She did not even flinch when he knelt and took her hands. Her skin was cool, the fingers limp. She let him lead her away without protest. Back in Whitcomb, the village gathered, hoping for some impossible restoration. But the child did not return their hope. She moved through the house as though she already knew it, walking directly to the nursery and laying her hand on the crib without hesitation. She never blinked when watched, her gaze fixed just past the observer as if listening to something faint and distant. At meals, she refused solid food, accepting only broth boiled to mush, and even then only after Arthur or the nurse stirred it clockwise 7 times. If they forgot, she would push the bowl away and hum, a sound so low it made the panes in the window tremble. The nurse whispered that animals would not stay in the room with her. The Whitcomb's old cat, usually content to sleep anywhere, bolted the moment the child entered. Dogs brought to the house for protection would whine and scratch at the door to be let out. More unsettling still, the hum she produced was familiar to Arthur. It was not music, not speech, but a tone he had heard in the vicar's cellar, buried in the old recordings, and again in Miriam Holt's halting testimony. It was the sound of something being held. When Harrow's name was spoken in the village again, it was in half-voiced accusations and questions no one wanted answered. Some believed he had returned the child as a mockery. Others that this was not Margaret at all, but something made in her image. Arthur wanted to believe otherwise, but the evidence gathered quietly against him. She did not remember her mother's face, did not recognize her father's touch, yet could describe the layout of the nursery in perfect detail, down to the position of the crib key on the day she vanished. 2 weeks after her return, Harrow disappeared. His rented cottage stood empty, its compartments pried open and bare. On the Whitcomb's doorstep lay a single wax cylinder in a paper wrapping, addressed not to Arthur but to the keeper of the crib. Arthur placed it in a drawer, unable to decide whether to destroy it or hide it forever. But the decision was taken from him when on a night thick with fog the child herself found it. She entered the parlor carrying the cylinder in both hands as though it were something fragile and sacred. She set it on the table, humming the low tone as she did, and waited. Arthur, torn between dread and the hope of answers, fetched the phonograph. The needle met the grooves, and the room filled with a sound so quiet it forced them to lean forward to hear. It was the slow creak of wood, the unmistakable rhythm of a crib rocking under careful, deliberate pressure. Between the creaks came a faint scraping like fingernails dragging along wood grain. Toward the end of the recording, the scraping paused, replaced by the sound of breathing. Not the quick breath of fear or exhaustion, but a steady inhale and exhale, slow enough to belong to someone watching rather than participating. Beneath it, barely audible, came a voice counting backwards in a language Arthur did not know. The numbers fell lower and lower until they reached 0. Then silence. The girl stood perfectly still, her face unreadable. When the cylinder stopped, she reached out, lifted it from the phonograph, and placed it back on the table as though returning it to its rightful place. She walked upstairs without looking at Arthur, her steps silent on the boards. That night he dreamed of the marsh, only in the dream it was inside the nursery. The crib floated there, the water black and endless beneath it, and from somewhere in the dark came that low hum, the same tone that now seemed to live inside the child's chest. He woke to find the house silent, yet the air in the room felt as though it had been stirred by something moving through it. By morning, the child was gone again. The door was bolted from the inside, yet when Arthur broke it down, the room was empty save for the crib and the folded blanket. On the pillow lay a single tooth, threaded through with a length of frayed twine. Arthur could not bring himself to burn the wax cylinder. Even after the child vanished a second time, it remained on the table for days, an object that seemed to pull the room toward it. The air around it felt heavier, as though sound itself had pooled there waiting to be released. When the vicar arrived, Arthur expected condemnation. But instead, the old man stared at the cylinder with a weariness that suggested recognition. They played it again, though both men kept their hands folded to keep from touching the phonograph. The same sounds emerged, the slow rocking creak, the intermittent scraping. But now, listening in the gray light of morning, Arthur noticed something beneath the breathing, so faint it felt imagined. A second voice whispering between the counts. The words were not in English, but their cadence was deliberate, matching the rhythm of the rocking. The vicar flinched when the counting reached 0. The silence that followed was not true silence. It was the kind that fills a room when all other sounds have been pulled out of it. They let the needle run until it began to click in the final groove, a dry, mechanical heartbeat. Neither spoke for a long while. When the vicar finally did, he said the numbers were a reversal, a countdown meant to undo something rather than measure toward it. The language, he suspected, was older than the parish itself, older even than the stones of the church. He warned Arthur that such recordings were not merely evidence but vessels, and playing them was an act of opening. That night, Arthur placed the cylinder back in its paper wrapping and sealed it in a box with nails hammered deep. Yet even sealed, it seemed to murmur through the wood. He hid it beneath the floorboards in the parlor, telling himself that burial was enough. Still, in the nights that followed, he would wake to hear the faint creak of the crib upstairs. Slow, measured in perfect time with the breathing on the recording. And sometimes, if he lay awake long enough, he thought he could hear the whispering too, threading its way down through the boards, patient as the tide. It happened on the coldest night of the year, the anniversary of Margaret's first disappearance. The village had no plans to mark the date. People preferred to keep their shutters closed, their lamps trimmed low, and their conversations to practical matters. Yet as the hour drew near midnight, an unseasonable stillness fell over Whitcomb. The sea's rhythm softened, the wind died, and the usual chorus of gulls and night creatures fell away as though the air itself had been cautioned to hold its breath. Then, without warning, every candle in the village went out. No gust of wind passed, no window had been left open, and yet from the church nave to the fishermen's cottages, flames were snuffed in a single instant, as if pinched by an unseen hand. Even the hearth fires dulled to embers, their light choked but their fuel unburned. People froze where they stood, straining to hear the intruder they could not name. Arthur, sitting in the parlor, felt the darkness arrive like a tide. He could hear the faint click of the nails beneath the floorboards where the cylinder lay sealed away, as if something had shifted against it. Upstairs, the crib creaked once, the sound so sharp in the quiet that it felt amplified, as though it had been carried directly into his skull. Across the village, people reported losing track of their own movements. A seamstress found herself standing in her kitchen with her needle still in her hand, though she had been mending in the bedroom moments before. A fisherman woke leaning against the outside wall of his own house, barefoot in the frost. Several children swore they had been visited during the darkness, claiming something crouched beneath their beds and watched them without moving. Its breathing so slow they wondered if it was alive at all. The vicar described hearing a hum from beneath the church floor, low and steady, vibrating through the soles of his boots. He did not go below to investigate. Instead, he knelt at the altar, though he admitted later he could not recall any prayer he had spoken. The only thing that returned to him clearly was the sense of being observed, not with malice, but with the calm precision of someone taking notes. When the candles relit themselves, they did so all at once, just as they had gone out. Flames bloomed with unnatural steadiness, their wicks untouched. In Arthur's parlor, the hearth fire roared as though fed a fresh log, though he had added none. The smell of beeswax lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable, and upstairs the crib was still rocking. By morning, the village was buzzing with contradictions. Some swore the night had been uneventful, dismissing the stories as nervous fancy. Others, shaken, packed their belongings and left without waiting for the tide to recede. A few claimed to have seen Harrow in the darkness, a tall figure walking the lane carrying a phonograph under one arm, his other hand steadying a candle whose flame burned with unnatural brightness. No official account was made, though privately people began to refer to it as the Night of All Candles. The name spread quietly beyond Whitcomb, carried by traders and sailors until it became a cautionary tale in towns that had never heard of Margaret Whitcomb. The details shifted in the telling. Sometimes the candles went out because a soul was being taken, sometimes because one had been returned. But always, the hum remained, and the sense that in those moments of extinguished light, the village belonged to someone else entirely. Arthur did not speak of the night to anyone, but he noticed changes in his own home. The patterns Eliza had carved into the crib and floorboards appeared sharper again, their edges clean as though freshly cut. The sealed box beneath the parlor floor seemed heavier when he stepped above it, and sometimes when the wind was still he could hear the faintest whispering beneath the creak of the crib upstairs, counting backwards in a language he could not name. The vicar visited him once, weeks after the event, and asked a single question. Had he played the cylinder again? Arthur told him no, but the vicar studied his face as though weighing the truth, then left without another word. From that night on, Arthur kept a candle burning beside his bed, not for light, but as a warning. If it ever went out without cause, he would know the night of all candles had come again, and whatever had passed through Whitcomb was not finished with him. In 1927, long after the Whitcomb house had been abandoned to salt and wind, a sealed government report surfaced in the county archives. It was marked for destruction, yet some clerk had filed it in the wrong drawer, where it lay undisturbed for decades. Inside were typewritten accounts, witness statements, and sketches from the Whitcomb case, each stamped with a symbol Arthur had seen before. 3 concentric circles crossed with straight lines. The report claimed Harrow had been part of a multi-generational network, their purpose to record and refine separation tones. Acoustic patterns believed capable of pulling human consciousness from its body without ending the body's life. It spoke of trials conducted across England and beyond, dating back centuries masked as folklore or spiritual rites. Some subjects returned changed, their memories fractured, their behaviors altered. Others never returned at all. Arthur's name appeared only once in a brief note stating he had refused further cooperation and had likely destroyed critical apparatus. There was no mention of Eliza's fate, nor of the child who came back wrong. Harrow's whereabouts were listed as unknown, though the report's closing line suggested he might still be active, assisted by those who believe his work essential to the preservation of something undisclosed. When word of the report reached Whitcomb, a memorial was proposed, not for Margaret alone, but for all the village's missing children. A stone plinth was raised in the churchyard, carved simply with names and the years they were lost. Yet when the time came to light candles at the unveiling, no one would agree to it. The vicar, now an old man, insisted on flowers instead. "Candles invite," he said, and left it at that. For the rest of his life, Arthur kept the sealed box with the wax cylinder hidden, moving it from place to place each time he felt the air change in a room. He never played it again, but sometimes he thought he could hear its creak in his sleep. When he died, the box could not be found. Some believed it had been buried with him. Others claimed it had been taken before his death by someone who knew exactly what it contained. The narrator's voice would end here, calm but heavy, reflecting on how evil rarely appears as a monstrous face in the crowd. It hides in method, in patience, in the quiet accumulation of small acts no one thinks to question until the pattern is complete. In Whitcomb, it took the form of a locked crib, a mother's silence, a sound that did not fade. The question left behind is not whether it happened. It is whether the work has ever truly stopped. What do you think? Could this happen again?